Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with JD Nye. He's the automotive practice lead at JD Power Canada. JD, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Todd.
Well, the last time I saw you, you were in your full-on ski gear at a fundraising event for Special Olympics Ontario. I was at the same
Yeah.
event, but we're not here today to talk about that. So,
No, it's still a little bit too warm out to start thinking about the next year's 24-hour race.
but we did a nice plug for Special Olympics in there, so it's all good. But we are here to talk about fixed operations, and more specifically, the consumer service study that you just completed, JD Power just completed, and it really looks at the consumer experience of getting their vehicle serviced at dealerships. So I got a copy of this year's study, some really interesting findings. But before we get into those findings, tell us a bit about the nuts and bolts of when the study was conducted, how what you measured, that type of thing.
Yeah, so this is one of our annual benchmark studies. It evaluates consumer behavior and satisfaction with service. And I know you mentioned at the dealership, but in this particular study, we also capture all of the aftermarket service locations as well, an aftermarket service. And it focuses in on owners of 4 to 12-year-old vehicles. So it's very much that, all the way from the early battleground years of in warranty, just out of warranty, when consumers are starting to migrate or make the switch to the aftermarket, all the way through kind of what is almost kind of end of vehicle life out to 12 years of ownership. So this year we were in field more or less between kind of the late April through June of this year, and the study obviously published this morning.
Okay, perfect. Now we're going to get in a minute to the rankings of who excelled, who didn't do so well. But before we do that, really tell us about the overall market, the service market for dealerships, particularly compared to the aftermarket. What's the service volumes? What's been happening out there? There's a lot of speculation about are people getting their vehicle serviced more or less, but you've got the hard data, so maybe share some of that overall look at the market for us.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the big story this year it is a really strong rebound from what we saw in the study results last year. So traditionally, the entire service market, again, we're talking about vehicles between 4 and 12 years old. In Canada, that meant a total service market of $9 or $10 billion, give or take. It was in traditionally kind of in that zone, and last year we saw that crater to $6.6 billion, and so a huge loss year over year in terms of overall market value for this particular marketplace. And in this year's study, we saw that really rebound to back up over $10 billion. And so not just recapture what was lost, between 2020 and 2021, but surpass that level as well. So a big rebound for the overall market. And then I would say in terms of the relationship between dealer and aftermarket, more of a return to a trend we had seen for a few years prior to the pandemic. So what I mean by that is if we took a big step back and looked 10 or 15 years ago, you would have seen a marketplace where the aftermarket enjoyed the majority of both service visits, which they still do, and also overall service revenue. And then over the course of time, dealers really started to kind of claw back incrementally, 1% here, 2% there, particularly that service revenue market share. And so last year, the aftermarket grabbed a bunch of that back. And this year is much more of a kind of a return to kind of traditional levels where the aftermarket enjoys a slight majority of the service visits. So this year, I believe the aftermarket captured 53% of overall service visits, while dealerships captured 58% of the revenues associated with those visits. And so that's, again, things swung in the favor of the aftermarket in the 2021 studies for a number of different reasons. And this year, we saw kind of a more of a return to the trend we had been watching for the last decade or so.
What's interesting is we're going to get into in a second the ranking of the consumer experience. I know dealerships are spending a lot of time working at the overall customer experience, more digitization, more online booking, this kind of thing, focusing on the convenience. And I don't want to steal the thunder for what we're going to talk about in a second, but I think some of those are the drivers that are driving that consumer satisfaction that might be underlying some of that behavior. But we'll get into that as our last segment. But what I really want to know now is who's on top. I mean, everybody keeps score, especially in the automotive industry, vehicle sales and otherwise. And I know that the OEMs and the dealerships watch this very carefully, and everyone wants to be at the top of their game. So who's on top? Who did really well in this year's survey? And maybe, yeah, we'll put up on screen maybe who's at the bottom and didn't do so well, but give us a quick snapshot and maybe some of the drivers you think driving that success.
Yeah, so this year we were really happy to be able to offer kind of two different segments, or look at the segments a little bit differently. So at the top of the dealership segment is Lexus this year, kind of a return to the top of the rank chart for that brand. I mean, they've been kind of a historical stalwart at the top of customer experience rankings for a long time. So they take the dealership service crown, while Napa Auto Pro is tops when it comes to non-dealership service. In fact, if we combined those two, Napa Auto Pro would be at the top overall. So very strong performance for that particular aftermarket brand this year.
Okay, and some of the other ones that are sort of closer to the top of the chart, maybe just so we get a sense of who's doing well.
Yeah, Mercedes-Benz also had a good year. They were close to the top when it comes to dealership service. Well, independents. So we don't rank independent shops officially on the rank chart, but if we were to do so, they would perform very well as a group on the non-dealer side, as did Great Canadian Oil Change performed quite well on the non-dealership side as well. Okay.
Well, we have a dealer audience, so we care about the aftermarket, but only like a little bit less for the Canadian auto dealer audience. So looking for how their OEM brands are doing. So what are some of the factors driving that top performance? Whether it's Lexus or you mentioned Mercedes, some of the other brands. What's driving that success?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting this year that I used to refer to the rank chart as a bit of a kind of choose your own adventure novel in that we have a number of different sub indexes that roll up into making up the overall score. And so traditionally, we would have seen a brand like Lexus perform at the top of the rank chart when it comes to facility and service quality or some of the other measures, while Napa Auto Pro could also get to a very similar spot on the rank chart by knocking it out of the park when it comes to working with a service advisor or the service initiation process. What we saw this year, and in fact, is that Napa Auto Pro also ended up at the top of the rank chart when it comes to the facility, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and that you've got a Lexus dealership or Mercedes-Benz did very well, for example, on the facility ranking as well. And I think it'll be an interesting trend to watch going forward, that this kind of facility paradox in that, and not to take anything away from Napa Auto Pro facilities, but they're not the amenity laden super high end experience that you do see in luxury dealerships. And so I think what that speaks to is that the facility, given that fewer and fewer people are kind of sitting around waiting in a facility, in fact, they're getting themselves kind of back to work or back to home and not sitting kind of indoors, that there might be kind of an interesting relationship there to watch going forward in terms of the just how important that that impressive facility kind of footprint happens to be. And in fact, it's what we're seeing when it comes to building trust. It really is more based on the expectations of the customer. And so if you can exceed their expectations in terms of the cleanliness of your facility, the comfort of the waiting area, you can actually really score quite well. And so while kind of an apples to apples perspective, you could see stark differences between an aftermarket waiting area and a Mercedes-Benz waiting area, the expectations of those customers are totally different. And so as long as an aftermarket location, for example, is exceeding those expectations, they can still score quite well.
Yeah, that's great insight. I know that you guys sit down with some of your OEM partners and review this stuff in more detail and help them move the metrics and such. But maybe if you could share a couple of key findings, in terms of the convenience and what drives loyalty and first impressions and things like that. I know the study actually identified some sort of high level findings. Maybe you could share a couple of those with us.
Yeah, I think the big one, kind of right off the top, is that communication is still key, but it really does matter how you're communicating with customers. Increasingly, people are not available or looking for their service advisor to call them. You know, I don't know about Utah, but my work day these days is spent almost exactly like this, basically all day on kind of Zoom calls and Teams calls, and so it's not super convenient for my dealership to call me, because even though I was on the phone a lot in the before times, at least in those days I could have a lot of my workday interaction in person with people, and so taking a phone call was not that big a deal. Now I think if one of your customers, for instance, has very clearly articulated a desire to be communicated with via email, or certainly where we see scoring at its peak is via text message, you really should have the capability and kind of all those kind of notes made on their file to say, no, this is how we're going to constantly communicate with this customer.
It's a good point. I mean, if you or I got a call right at this moment, it would be pretty inconvenient because we're doing a live video interview. So exactly the way a lot of people are, for sure. Is there anything else maybe around? I think there's something in there about first impressions. Maybe you just share one finding around that.
Yeah, so this year in the study, I kind of alluded to it before, but we inserted a new kind of trust index or trust battery of questions, and those questions actually are being embedded across all of JD Power's surveys globally. So regardless of the industry that we're talking about, so some of them are kind of cross-industry or more generic. Obviously, in the auto practice, we inserted a couple of specific trust-based questions for the service business. They're questions like, this business has my best interests in mind. I trust my advisor when he provides X advice, and so that that question, for instance, is true for a service advisor in a dealership or my financial advisor in a bank. I trust that my dealership has the right technology to fix my vehicle properly. So questions that really try and build this perception, or give us a better understanding of what does that mean, because as we all know, if you trust a business, you're much more likely to continue to do business with them. And so we're in the kind of early days of the analysis on that, but as you pointed out, some of those first impressions really do appear to be incredible trust builders. And so while the overall facility ranking, or the weight the facility takes in the overall CSI index scoring is reasonably low this year, it's in and around 12% of the overall scoring. When it comes to building that first impression or building that trust, it actually is quite important. And certainly from a dealer perspective, and again, we're talking in this range, we're talking about owners of vehicles between 4 and 12 years old. So really that kind of early battleground. What we do find is that if dealerships can stop the first visit to the aftermarket, that's really their best shot at success. Because the aftermarket, certainly the higher ranked players in the aftermarket, like the Napa Auto Pros, they do a really good job. And if a customer goes there the first time, all of our numbers show that they are much more likely to begin to trust that operation with more and more of their service requirements. And so stopping that first, getting in the way of that first ever point of defection is really, really key
for the dealerships. Excellent insights, JD, and I appreciate you joining us here today. And maybe if I don't see you before then, I'll definitely see you out on the slopes at Blue Mountain to helping raise money for Special Olympics. So
absolutely looking forward to it. Thanks for your time, bud.
Okay, signing off.